Okay, so let me just turn this on. Okay, I think that we will get started. Let me see. Hopefully everyone can see and hear. If not, please just say something in the chat, I think. Okay, looks like we have a thumbs up. Great. So, hi. My name is Sarah Blaget. Thank you for joining us for this online conversation happening on the occasion of Sell the Farm, currently on view here at SARA'S through October 8th. So today we are joined by artists Elia Jung and Rachel Rosheger, and curator and artist Eileen Isagon. Welcome and thanks again for being here. Now I'll hand it over to Eileen, who will say a few more words and get the talk started.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Rachel and Leo today about the exhibition. Just to share a little bit about myself, as Sarah mentioned, I'm a writer, curator, and artist, and I specialize primarily in digital media. But speaking as a curator, I'm situated in this continuous intersection of art and technology, but I'm also deeply invested in performance and the performance of objects. Most recently, I've worked on online exhibitions and digital programming and editorial for different venues, including David Swerner and Rhizome and the Whitney Museum. I'm working on starting an artist-led fund on chain called Gemma Projects. And I'm currently a mentor for New Ink's Art and Code track for their year 10 residents. But enough about me. I'm here to introduce two brilliant artists, Rachel Rosheger and Elia Jung, whose joint exhibition, Sell the Farm, is open at SARA'S through October 8th, as she mentioned. Rosheger is based in New York and graduated from the Cooper Union in 2017. Her recent solo exhibitions include Gone Before You Get There at Microscope Gallery in New York, and her work has been included in group exhibitions at Lower Cavity in Massachusetts, Parent Company in New York, Fragment Gallery also in New York, Harkawick in New York, and As It Stands, Los Angeles, among others. Elia Jung is an artist based between Hamburg and Berlin, whose work is concerned with the intersection of science and temporality, spanning sculpture and installation. His writing has been published in Do Not Research, and his work has been exhibited recently in exhibitions at Like a Little Disaster Gallery in Italy, Loeb Block in Berlin, and Frappant, forgive my pronunciation, in Hamburg. Jung previously studied in Berlin, and he's currently continuing his studies at HFBK. To open the conversation today, I will share just a little bit about the exhibition before moving forward into our Q&A and conversation with the artists here. Sell the Farm brings together two bodies of work from Elia Jung and Rachel Rosheger, sourced from a shared penchant for patents, attempts to harness natural forces and the emotional alterities of scientific phenomena. The two draw on topics as diverse as HVAC systems, corrosive metals, and the ongoing scientific effort to revive the woolly mammoth in the Siberian steppe. In Jung's plexiglass and wood sculptures and Rosheger's series of silver point drawings and metal sculptures, such influences become a pointed visual poetics, both invigorated and vexed by the schemes and dreams of human civilization on the brink of collapse. Thank you so much, Rachel and Leo, for joining us today. Do you want to say hello to everyone?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the intro, Eileen. I'm looking forward to the talk.
Yes, hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And also, thank you to Sarah and Leo and Eileen. And I'm, very excited. So thank you.
Of course. Yeah, we've got some friends in the audience, I see. So it's really exciting to have you all here. We're going to keep it pretty conversational today. I have some prompts for the artists, and then we're going to address some questions from the audience at the very end, including those left in the chat. So if anything comes up, feel free to drop it in there during the conversation as well. So Leo and Rachel, both of you have a shared interest in this idea of environmentalism and are harnessing these natural forces in your works, looking at scientific phenomena. Leo, your sculpture is in the work cycle called The Living Diamonds of Yakutia. Imagine a natural history museum that doesn't quite exist yet. And this positions this bold scientific idea that the resurrection of the woolly mammoth could preserve the health of threatened ecosystems in the Arctic. Can you share a little bit more with everyone here about how you arrived at this series? I know we were talking before about this, and it's really, really just such an interesting body of work and research.
Yes, thank you so much for the question, Eileen. I think, well, I believe the answer to this question needs a little bit of context. I promise to keep it brief, but just to give a couple of...
You don't have to.
Back in 2020, in fact, actually, I was researching ambitious solutions to the climate crisis, and I was captivated by a project called Pleistocene Park. Two scientists, a father and a son, both called Zimov, set up a vast area in the Siberian steppe to introduce animals into the area because they argued that the local ecosystem in its current form is less productive than it could be with more human intervention. Of course, this was back when a lot of people were debating the term of the Anthropocene, and were mostly agreeing on letting nature do its thing, essentially. I remember during COVID, the slogan "Nature is healing" turned into a bit of a political debate, because when less traffic and less production during the first lockdowns was turning out to be evidently beneficial to natural ecosystems worldwide quite immediately, it was basically essentially a call to natural conservationism by backing off. Less intervention, just do nothing. That's like the best way of handling nature, essentially. But what I found so interesting with Zimov's approach was that their argument seemingly essentially went into the opposite direction. This ecosystem in itself can be called healthy, but for an entirely healthy ecosphere, it needs to look vastly differently. The Anthropocene for them doesn't mean to step away from nature and leave it to its own devices, but to take full responsibility for it now by taking full control over it. And the theory behind the science made for various facts and ideas I found extremely poetic from an artistic perspective. To give an example, the warming climate is melting away permafrost in Siberian soil. Famously, this gives way for the remains of ice age creatures, such as the woolly mammoth. So you can currently find tons of mammoth bones on the shores of on the northern hemisphere. There's little to be done to slow down the cooling of the soil in as little time as we have, other than to try to compress it from above, for which you need to apply a lot of weight. You could either drive over the area that is vastly lacking in this kind of infrastructure with big machinery, or you try to get big animals to do that job for you. Now, the biggest animals that we have, like elephants and rhinos, wouldn't be able to survive in that climate without a big coat of fur, which is exactly what scientists are working on right now. Of course, the marketing is labeling the future animal breed as a mammoth instead of an elephant with fur, but the temporal poetry is there. So humankind brings mammoths to extinction 10,000 years ago, and now that we're facing our own, we want to bring them back to help us out. As their bones come up from the ground, their bodies come back to life. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to continue these parallels and temporality by essentially staging a historical exhibition of something that has yet to happen. It was also a way for me to comment on certain inevitabilities of how I believe venture capital operates today. There are points to be made about how capitalism commodifies its own demise, but only if it's entertaining enough for itself, for example. Thank you.
That's a really great answer. Thank you, Leo. There's a lot of irony here, and I think that it's just a really poignant sort of observation how essentially humans, having exhausted Earth's biological resources and turned all of this natural material into oil, we're now like looking into the resurrection of the mammoth as a way to resolve our problematics with nature, things that we caused. And I think that it's really also very interesting that you bring up this sort of pause or moment that we saw during the pandemic, where we realized that actually lack of human intervention is what nature needs. So all of this money, this billions of dollars of research and scientific effort may be making it worse. Would you agree with that?
I think it's complicated, if I'm being honest. Like I think I like to believe in, well, I personally like to believe in technology. I think that's like something that, like, you know, as humans maybe we're kind of good at. Obviously the way that, you know, big tech, I mean, you know, technology is basically in the hands of big tech companies that, you know, operate under certain paradigms that I don't agree with largely. Makes it hard to, you know, sort of make a claim for technology. But I think if that is something that we're good at, maybe we should lead into it. And I think just sort of refraining from nature is maybe something that, like, historically we've not been good at all. And so maybe there's just a bit of a sort of law of nature here that makes it hard for me to see a future in essentially just like entirely backing off from what even is nature at this point. You know, like I guess like the idea of Anthropocene sort of makes it sort of hard to, you know, find the clear distinctions also, maybe.
Yeah, super interesting. I too try to remain somewhat optimistic about technology and technological forces being introduced. Rachel, I think, so the two of you connected really in this series, in this exhibition over the industrial period, and you're both speaking primarily about a lot of the destructive forces that are sort of paradoxically intertwined with a bit of hope and optimism, which we just touched on a little bit. Could you expand a little bit about how your work concerns itself with optimism or romanticism as a reaction to some of these destructive forces?
Yeah, so that's kind of a theme that I'm constantly kind of picking at in my work, which is this tension between a kind of romanticized past and an industrial present, you know, which is a theme that comes up a lot in the 19th century. And that's a period I'm really interested in, especially in the United States, or primarily in the United States. But, you know, this work is specifically looking at, well, the two sculptures in the show, which are these two copper sculptures that are both referencing designs from two different inventors, one being Tesla and then one a successor of his, which are referencing these designs, these patents for conductive balloons that would harness ambient electricity in the air that's being wasted, or at least that's the claim. And these designs were never proven, or, you know, testing was done and it was like very treacherous, led to kind of disastrous ends. So there's this kind of like hopeful optimism in those, in these balloons that I was like really fascinated by, because also just the form of a balloon is kind of loaded with a lot of that kind of, you know, this hopefulness or happiness or joy and celebration. But then in this context, there are these kind of like doomed balloons, these kind of like disastrous, kind of treacherous objects. And like, so this one is the kind of direct reference, and I actually designed it based on the descriptions by Hermann Clausen, who is the successor of Tesla, as we're referencing. It's you know, it's kind of this like grotesque object a little bit, like it's been scorched, and, you know, even just kind of so it's lined with this thick copper foil, which is what he describes to do, and even just like that process is very kind of gnarly, and so the balloon is very gnarly. So, you know, there's this like, yeah, obviously this tension between this object of this kind of hopeful possibility for a kind of free energy, and you know, both of the inventors kind of painted it as this public service that would, you know, be very utopian. But yeah, we saw obviously like the direction that, you know, the kind of actual advancements in energy from that time period led us to what we have now, which is the electrical grid, which is, you know, very much not free and also very much not utopian. Like it's decaying, and it's really actually kind of like a crisis that we're not talking about that much. Anyway, sorry. So yeah, you know, there's just a lot of, during this time period, there is so much of this kind of like wonder and awe around very much electricity, which is very much my interest, but just, you know, progress. And then yeah, we're kind of like very much living in the kind of horrors of that now. And we've like seen the kind of ramifications of these ideas of progress. And so I think, yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question adequately, but
Yeah, I think you have. I think this was really poignant, and there's like an interesting sense of optimism around the balloon as this object that is, you know, obviously like upward, looking skyward. That what came to mind for me was actually a lot of like the metaphors we use for the internet today and like the cloud, and this idea of upward mobility, and the fact that you expressed that like the electrical grid is actually very much embedded in the ground. And in terms of the cloud ecosystem now, there are so many, you know, facilities, data storage, buildings physically that we don't see. And a lot of that kind of thing with electricity as well is like so much of its destruction is abstracted away so often. And so to be putting these kinds of images and relations into objects that we can, you know, that do not obfuscate those relationships, I think is really interesting. I would love for you to also share a little bit more about your silver point drawings. It's such a fascinating medium to me of drawing and mark making. And I'm curious if it's important to you to embed the artworks with conductive material as well.
Yeah, so I'll kind of introduce the medium because it's virtually obsolete at this point, because it's a very old technique that is pre-graphite, and then once graphite was invented, it kind of fell out of favor for a lot of reasons. It's a really interesting medium because you're actually mark making with metal. You know, you actually don't have to use silver. Silver point is the most common, but there's also gold point and copper point. But you're actually, you know, scratching into a piece of paper with metal and leaving behind a mark. So, you know, it's a really strange medium. At first sight, it really looks like graphite in some ways, but you know, has a lot of unique characteristics. Its tonal range is really narrow. It cannot get very dark. It's more luminous, and you know, yeah, actually, you know, they're really hard to document, and they're even more impossible to view compressed. So like, I don't even know if anyone can see the drawings through the Zoom, but I implore you to come see the show, see them in person. And also, you know, you can see the images not compressed on the website, but anyway, you can detect it all, you know, what's going on. I've been working on this body of work with the medium where I'm kind of exploring mark making that is kind of creating a sense of removal and erasure, and you actually can't erase with silver point because it's metal and paper. And so, you know, that was sort of a important characteristic of it for me. And but specifically I'll go back to the conductive aspect. So yeah, because it's metal in the paper and silver specifically, which is the most conductive metal, it's technically conductive, and so it's alive, and or theoretically, you know, like it has the capability to move electric particles through it, and like it's literally could you know, sustain the motion of matter, which is something I'm really interested in. And I really like that it's, you know, kind of activated. It could be activated in this way, but then it's also corrosive because it's metal, so it's activated by the air and the atmosphere. So actually the drawings like do oxidize over time, and they tarnish, which in this case that means they darken and also kind of change in hue. Like there's a really kind of interesting process that happens to them, which is, it's kind of a coveted aspect of the medium. They kind of richen over time, which was something I was really interested in. But yeah, like, so I think that the thing you know, that was really important for me to explore with this is, you know, because this is also throughout my work, is I'm taking materials that are kind of associated with permanence and strength and durability, metal, and kind of exploring its fragility or its vulnerability or you know, ethereality and change. And so, you know, I'm exploring that in the subject matter and the mark making, but also that's true just in the actual material. And so, you know, I just think about, you know, I also work in charcoal, which is like this medium, this material that's actually dead. Like it's literally like dead, it's dust, you know, it's burnt material, versus this, like, you know, it's actual metal in the paper. So it's like, you think of it as being kind of rigid, but it's actually more mutable than like dust. Which, so that kind of is a kind of theme I'm really interested in. But and then, sorry, just to go back to it being conductive, you know, like all my work is exploring conductivity, but I mean, I'm literally using conduits in my work, which are like actual tubes that, you know, are used for the flow of electricity. And you know, it felt really interesting to kind of explore that in mark making as well. And you know, this subject wise, I'm very interested in this kind of like movement and flow of matter, like within the subject and within the stylistic choices, you know. So just kind of that nice synchronicity with the material.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about charcoal. It feels like, I don't know, at first glance there is a little bit of weight to it, but you described it as like ephemeral in this way, like dust, which is really poetic. I'm curious if you could share just a little bit about the inscriptions on the sides of the frames, because I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are seeing them in the slides here and wondering.
Yeah, so that was kind of this kind of fun thing that came out of working on the rooster sculpture in the show, which has chemical etching onto the rooster as part of the sculpture. And I started kind of playing with chemical etching from that, and it ended up kind of working its way onto the custom frames. Originally, I was making these rusted frames, and then I thought, you know, like, why don't I push that even further and actually kind of use chemicals and eating away of the material to explore the revealing of information. And that's kind of what I was doing with the rooster, where the etching is the Tesla patent. So it's this design for one of the conductive balloons, and you also see that on the frame there, as you can see. But so you know, it's kind of it just kind of adds like more layers to the drawings, which you know, I always am kind of excited about having just more and more layers of information. But the inscriptions, so you know, this is the Tesla design for the conductive balloon here, but then the inscriptions are actually taken from Cicero's Republic, and it's a part of that called the Dream of Scipio, which is about, it's actually the first kind of, it's a kind of framework for a lot of Western esoteric, you know, it's a foundation for Western esoteric ideas of like astral projection. And it's kind of like one of the first examples of the like a human spirit like ascending into the cosmos and like reflecting on Earth. And so the excerpt from the excerpt that's inscribed onto the frames is this part of that story, where Scipio is this Roman general who's part of the fall of the sack of Carthage. He's like looking down at Earth, and his grandfather visits him in the cosmos and tells him, you know, kind of to start reflecting on the sort of you know, the vanity of earthly efforts in the broader sort of cosmos or whatever, you know. So but the actual excerpt is this like really beautiful kind of musing on motion and the way that like motion works in the cosmos versus like kind of man-made motion or something. Like that's how I was thinking about it. And that kind of relates to the subjects of the drawings, which are
Totally.
systems. But
wow, thank you for sharing. This is like really a lot of, yeah, it's loaded with information.
it's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool to learn about. And just speaking of Western esoteric thinking, I was hoping for Leo to share a little bit more with us about the illustrations that appear in the Whole Earth Catalog series that you have shown in the exhibition. I think that they each have this potential to reveal or hint at varying points of tension. And I'm curious what made you choose the Whole Earth Catalog as a point of departure for this series.
Yeah, wow, what a what an amazing segue. That for a minute, like you went from Roman early thought to like oh wow, but yeah, it's good, just potent. Okay, so but okay, where do I start? So when Rachel and I first started talking to each other about the show and how to put things together, we sort of realized that we were each of us in a way was sort of dealing with a pivotal moment that defined or rather like a moment where technology defined a social shift And we talked about the industrial period, which plays a huge role in Rachel's work, and so does the so-called shift from counterculture to cyberculture to me, which is a phenomenon that is largely accredited to the 60s, rather late 60s and early 70s in California. And there was a publication called the Whole Earth Catalog that basically is that was very influential in paving the way for people that basically went on to found what later turned into Silicon Valley. So it's a very interesting piece of history, and as I said, like maybe one of these like pivotal moments that can be compared to the industrial period, and I think a lot about like how that late 60s hippies counterculture moment could turn into one of the basically most conservative political apparatuses of today, and so I have these plaques in the show, one of which is actually in the slideshow right now. It's this graphic of a log cabin, and I believe it was taken from a sort of it was to advertise a book that teaches you how to build one of these log cabins, and there's also two-part series of these thermoform plaques in the exhibition that show animals that I thought were quite interesting in relationship to some of the other pieces in the show. So the first one is actually a sort of graphic illustration, two-step graphic illustration that shows the body and wing motions of an eagle, exactly, taking off into flight. And I thought, like, I chose the eagle because I thought it was such a canonical symbol for American libertarianism, and which is, I guess, like one of the defining underlying ideologies of Silicon Valley, and its sort of relationship to deregulation and freedom of enterprise and all these things, and then the other one, the other two-part series actually is a sort of instructional manual for what to do when trying to outrun a bull, and and I thought that was very funny in regards to essentially it's a direct reference to one of the bigger pieces in the show that's actually a very large cardboard mammoth. And that was meant to be, or is meant to be, a kind of updated version of the Charging Bull statue on Wall Street, and so I wanted to have another a bull in the show, and basically like it explains like the best way to outrun a bull is that if you distract it by taking off a piece of clothing and throwing it on the ground, so it's sort of preoccupied with that. And I think that's just very interesting to think about, like, what does that mean? And like, if the bull represents capital, who's the person running away? What's the piece of cloth? Like, I think that's just like a very interesting metaphor when thinking about that in the context of Silicon Valley, but also I guess in the context of venture capitalism.
Totally. I think it's so interesting that a lot of these progressive ideas introduced by the Whole Earth Catalog actually became this very conservative apparatus in space. And I think during our earlier conversation, Leo, you shared a really funny anecdote, which I think is prevalent in this series as well, just about how on the level of language, conservationism and conservatism have like such a strong tie. And I think that metaphor, and it's just so poignant within this piece in this series. And in fact, the animal is such an intriguing continuous motif throughout the whole exhibition. Obviously, Rachel, the rooster is this symbol of American pastoralism, and then the eagle and bull represent these American ideals of very like hardy, rugged individualism and capitalism. And I think it all sort of loosely reacts to this American identity of the rural. I would love for maybe each of you to share a little bit of your take on how American pastoralism or neo-pastoralism is taking root in your works.
Sure. Do you want, or I'll start?
Either one.
Yeah, I think the way I'm engaging with the sort of American pastoralism is a lot of this kind of looking backwards and this kind of nostalgia, which, that's the case throughout any kind of pastoralism in a way. I think, the American pastoralism is this ideology that is like so contradictory because, so it's like this conflation of like a desire for technological progress and like a bucolic retreat, because any actual genre of pastoralism kind of emerged from European pastoralism. And so and actually even like the expansion of rural America was like predicated on European ideas of progress, so this idea of like, a kind of rural America is like so tied to, like your European progress and which are kind of things that, the claim, of the pastoral perspective is very antithetical to that. So, actually the weather vane, the rooster is such a great example of this, and part of why I'm really interested in it, because it's like this total like American folk art and iconic Americana, but it's actually the result of colonists bringing it from Europe to the New World via, they brought weather vanes because this was a popular symbol. It's a popular object in Europe at the time, and the weathercock was the most popular weather vane and was the first weather vane recorded in the US. And the reason it was popular was because at a certain point, the Pope got really fixated on it as like a Christian symbol, and so decreed that every church across Europe had to have a rooster as the weather vane. So the weathercock has all these like ties to this like very, very European symbology, and also was brought by colonists to America. And so it's like this, but it's become this, kind of American kind of like iconic symbol of this American pastoralism. So anyway, so that's kind of like a really kind of direct look at that kind of irony or contradiction to like American identity, which is so tied to Europe. Also, I think again, this kind of like idea of kind of this like rejection of technology or progress within pastoralism is so we're seeing it now. Like I'm really obsessed with kind of subcultures of what like I've been calling this like neo-pastoralism now, which is like off-grid culture on YouTube and like TikTok homesteaders, and like it's just kind of
like cottagecore.
Yeah, it's like this, it's like the same thing as it was in the 19th century. But it's like this desire for autonomy and some kind of sense of control over one's environment in the face of like deepening complexities of technology, and like so it's such a one-to-one with that period. And it's a seductive kind of ideology, because like who doesn't want to have like fresh eggs in the morning rather than having to kind of like go to the store and like look at all of the eggs and be like, what do I buy ethically, or it's like, but it's like obviously these kind of gestures towards a rejection of this complexity are really flawed, because they're still just tied to the broader systems and capitalism on so many levels. So it's a really misguided kind of and it always has been this like kind of misguided reaction to very real problems. And anyway, I'm going on and on, but Leo, you should interject.
No, thank you. That was very interesting. I feel like I learned a lot. Your answer just about. Anyways, Leo, I would love for you to have a chance to respond to the question and just to reframe it a little bit. It's just in response to how does your work sort of frame this American identity of the rural?
Interesting. Okay, so I mean, I just as to respond to Rachel, I think like in a lot of respects, I totally agree with you. Like, especially in regards to the sort of like the symbolic vessel of the rooster. Like, we're kind of talking about like a rooster as an animal, like, you know, like a rural and farm animal, you know, that can be associated with, you know, pastoralism, and, you know, farming in general. But then at the same time, I feel like that's a part that I resonate with a lot, is that I think is that, like, maybe it's better to think about neo-pastoralism as a sort of as a sort of abstract version of that, where it can, like, maybe that term can be more productively applied when thinking about it as a sort of as sort of livestock, land, you know, like all these things, more as alternates in a system of ownership, of distribution of goods, services, ideas, and platforms. But what I personally mean is that, like, I find, like, for example, like, what I find exciting to think about is when a recipient of my pieces in the show would see past the bodies of animals and see them as a sort of symbolic carriages of ideas they have become over time, far from like their use as farm animals, for example, right? Like, I mean, the bull, you know, it's like, we don't talk about the bull as a bull, but like, it has, you know, has a very particular cultural meaning in the US, and you know, it and that and I think ideally we would be able to analyze what is subtextual to what we gradually normalized as part of Western life, whatever it is today, whoever it applies to. And I guess, like, whatever our California is and the ideology is that we choose to govern it with. Like, I think that's sort of, it's important to sort of you know, bring it to the abstract layer, to understand that these things change, and that, you know, what we talk about cattle, but cattle is, like, you know, has a different role in, you know, in today's economy than it used to have, you know, 150 years ago, for example. Now, the idea of the rural of the American rural, for me in my work, I'm German, for example, like, I'm very far removed from the American rural, but I like to think about it a lot, because I think it's sort of, it speaks, like, to me as a sort of, like, as a European, of a sort of aspirational trauma or something, where, like, it's sort of like, it's, you know, that sort of frontier spirit is something that I think attracts a lot of people here, and I find that incredibly interesting to analyze, and to look into, and also, like, to, you know, to diagnose myself to a certain extent, and I think that's the reason why I gravitate towards it. But it's definitely research. It's like, I realize it's far away from me. Like, everything's quite new to me when it comes to it. Yeah.
If everyone in the audience can come away from this talk with one thing, I think it should be aspirational trauma. That's really, like, what I feel so deeply, that we're, like, hurtling towards in American culture. And I think there's been, like, this lineage of techno-utopian and capitalist thinking that's fueling environmentalism, which has been rebranded into different kinds of like neoliberal greenwashing. And I think that both of your works sort of touch on this, but Leo, I think that your work really touches on this notion of the present day climate crisis, and sometimes bizarre solutions proposed to solve them. And I'm curious if you feel that these sorts of solutions are sort of grounded in a material reality, or if they are more like venture capitalist pipe dreams.
Well, I think the trouble is that we live in an economic and political moment in which venture capitalist pipe dreams are essentially turning into people's material reality. I think there's no real, you know, distinguishment to be made there. Deregulation under the continuous reign of neoliberal policies has effectively put big tech companies in control. The bizarre thing today, I think, is that most companies actually register that the climate crisis is threatening their operations, and find ways to make their production, you know, sustainable, because of public pressure and because it secures them more economic longevity. As I mentioned before, like, I truly believe in the power of research and technology. Like, I don't have a problem with technology. I think that's like there is a reactionary turn to sort of you know, detest technology as an idea. And I think the problem we have at the moment is just that like that the structure of funding of science is just is basically distributed through private companies whose only interest is to, or often whose only interest is to align with the dynamics of the market, or general public attention. And that makes for a very bad combination. What I would personally like to see is more public funding and ambitious research projects and strong public institutions backing the forefront of science, rather than what we have right now.
Right, because right now what we have is sort of these tech companies self-justifying their own research for more economic stability and longevity, as you said. I do want to leave some room for questions from the audience. We have one in the chat, and then we're able to take a few more from people as they arise. There's a really juicy question that's been sitting in the chat. So we can start there. Elliot asks, are you for or against genetic cloning? I'll let each of you answer.
Rachel, do you want to start?
Oh my God, I feel like
it's a big
definitely directed at you, Leo, because you probably have a lot more to say on that than me. But I've, rather than try to take a crack at something that I, really have not done any real meaningful research on, what I will say is, actually I was just kind of thinking about what you were just saying, Leo, and this kind of relates to it, where, I also want to say, like, I am completely on the side of technology and theory and progress in theory. I feel like part of what we've been talking about, where this, like, with the pastoralism thing is like, the response is not to reject technology and progress. Like, that is the goal. Like, where that go, that's actually should be neutral. Like, where that goes is determined by other forces. But in theory, like, we need progress. Like, we need things to be better than they are right now. And I think that but in order to do that, I think we have to fundamentally shift the way that we understand nature and the way that we understand waste, and so, like, to me, I think, a lot of what I'm looking at are energy systems and the flow of energy. And I think that our relationship to those things are, we're not considering the full cycle, and to not be negative about the sort of, at least on the surface of the pastoral impulse, which is to, like, be in touch with nature. Like, a lot of my work is sort of looking at, like, okay, like, I want to be in touch with those cycles. Like the weathercock, like, I just was very negative about it, the rooster, but, like, the whole point of a weather vane is to be in touch, is for farmers to know what direction the wind is blowing in order to make predictions about the weather. And that requires, like, a certain type of connection to the present, like, your present space and environment, that, like, I think most of us just really don't have anymore. And anyway, I'm speaking very, like, abstractly, but I just think, fundamentally what matters, whether it's replicating genes or not, like, we need to like, not see ourselves as separate from these things that we're using or intervening with. I don't know, does that make sense? That's probably, like,
yes, it does.
Unrelated to the question,
but Leah, did you have an answer for the genetic cloning question?
I mean, so far I don't necessarily see a problem with cloning. I mean, I don't necessarily, like, have a, like, ethical issue with it. I don't think.
My question is
it's
playing God.
Sorry?
Like playing God.
Do I have a problem with playing God?
Or like technology, like our human, like, in, like, relationship with the environment / like, playing God.
Well, Stuart Brand said something that I keep coming back to because I think it's very interesting. It genuinely makes me think. Like, I don't say this in an entirely critical way, but I think it's actually very interesting. He said, humans were born as gods. We just have to become good at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was always, like, something. There was always something to that. Like, that maybe I like the idea of, like, assuming responsibility, which is, like, why I sort of, I like the idea of sort of taking control and trying to make sure that everything runs smoothly and, like, every being on Earth is happy. I don't have an issue with humans performing things that previously have been preserved to God.
Okay, that makes sense.
We have some more questions in the chat here. EVR asks, for Rachel, I'm curious, knowing your body of work, what motivated the decision to omit your LED screens?
Thank you. That's a great question because this show is one of the first bodies, it's the first body of work where I haven't included actual electricity in my references to electricity in the sculptures. And for me, that was like a sort of moment of like, okay, how do I get into these interests with, or sorry, let me back up. How do I explore the kind of aspects of electricity that I'm interested in without it being so literal? When I'm using the electronics, I'm actually engaging with electricity in this very literal way. Whereas, these two copper sculptures now are without any actual electronics, like they're not electrified. There's no actual electricity running through the pieces, but they could be. They have they're completely made out of copper and they're completely conductive, and so like they in some ways are like implying that they're electronics. Yeah. And so I was like, so much of what I'm interested in with the LEDs is this kind of like materiality of like electricity. And so I think actually stripping the works of that element kind of further pushed that interest and had this put even more sort of pressure on and emphasis on the kind of those materials. It was kind of a challenge to say like, okay, I'm going to remove these kind of very obvious conversations with electricity in the work and just kind of, the actual LED screens, and then see okay, what's missing, like how do I like push these materials even further to continue that conversation in my work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I see another question in the chat, but first Timmy Simmons is raising his hand, but I can't unmute him. Sarah, are you able to unmute him so we can?
Yeah, Sarah did unmute me. Hi.
Oh, okay, great. Go for it. Hi.
Hey. First of all, thanks everybody. It's I think everybody spoke so eloquently about their work, and it's really wonderful the connections that you made. I have a question I have several questions, but I'll reserve some for later. But I wonder, it sort of jumps off of what Rachel just said, when you were talking about like something literally being literally acting in the things that you're referring to or not. We started with this discussion of like harnessing energy, and the word harnessing really sort of sticks with me in thinking about certain histories of sculpture and like contemporary histories of sculpture, of how objects and sculptures relate to the things that they're, quote, talking about, if there's anything that we can say they're about. And what's particular about both of your practices to me is, there's a wealth of research in and around your work that is, it's a particular kind of research, I think. And I am wondering, like this word harness, if you would use the word harness, like if you would use a different word to describe the relationship between the research that you do and the objects that result from it. And so ultimately kind of the relationship between you or between us as an audience and these objects. Like, would you use the word harness to say like these objects sort of harness this research? Or would you say, I wonder if you have any reactions to that?
Thank you. It's an amazing question. I would love for Leo to start, because I've spoken a bit, but I would love to hear, your response to that.
Wow, I didn't even. Okay. Thank you for the question. I wouldn't use that word for describing my pieces. I think that's like the maybe the simple answer. Harness. Poof. I like to use this word informed by research. That's maybe like a bit of a sort of like easy way out or something, because like I think like what like a lot of, I think like maybe, okay, here's the thing. I think harnessing sounds like you're sort of extracting, or rather sort of, you know, like you have a little device that, like, you know, like a bucket or something, and then like you have a lot of information that, like, you know, and like when the bucket is full with information, then that bucket is maybe the artwork. And I think and I think I like to read a lot, and I like to keep informed, and then there's like moments where I make things that I realize are informed by these various strains of research and harnessing information, but they're not maybe as linear as that word suggests. That would be sort of my answer to the question, maybe.
Well, I would add that, like, for me, I mean, I think this is a great question for both of us, because we both have such a, kind of research heavy practice. But for me, it's like, ultimately, I'm not doing research, like I'm creating form, like that's what I'm invested in. And so I think ultimately, we can talk about all these themes and like get excited about them, but at the end of the day, to me, what matters is the material and not and the form. Like, it's what is that kind of direct meaning that the piece is giving. And this kind of, it's not didactic, it's not about illustrating ideas that came out of even like poetic ideas. It's like, what is this actual form saying, in itself? And I think, like, I mean, I think that just, once you've kind of spent enough time researching and compiling information, and just there's something that just, like, there's a kind of process of both like emotion. It's like where, yeah, like your heart and your brain like meet, and just things like come out of it. And I think that there's no sort of there's no way that like just research can really get you there. Like there's the balloon, it's like right in front of me, so I keep thinking right in the slideshow, but it's like that piece was this like actually one-to-one design from research, like it's from this patent. And it ended up, to me, being actually in so many ways like the most sort of layered and poetic piece, because there's so many associations with it. It's so, I think it's like really emotive to look at. Like it's, like the form of the balloon. Like to me, that's like the most exciting thing with sculpture, is when you make something that's like literally like you're trying to make a one-to-one version of this thing you researched, maybe, and then it just like actually becomes this whole other thing. And I think the mammoth is kind of that for Leo, maybe, where it's like, you could just, you have it described like it's a patent, like we're both making these exact sort of replicas of patents, but the way that big cardboard skeletal mammoth like sits in the space, like that's a whole other thing. Like that is not the patent. Like that's a that's a form, like that's an artwork,
an object.
yeah, and it has a whole other meaning, and I think that that's what's so like exciting, is it's like it's not the research, like it is its own entity with its own meanings and its own kind of, anyway, sorry, now I'm going on about like totally other stuff, but yeah, it's a great question.
Great.
Amazing
Yeah,
question.
I think like despite the fact that it comes from this replicable sort of carbon copy instruction manual, each iteration, each manifestation of that object represents something wholly new. And I think it's a really great point, and thank you for your question. We have a little bit more time here, and I do want to address Genevieve's question in the chat. For the two of you, if you could talk a little bit more about how you pair science and magic, or the real and achievable with the impossible, and then dialed, or the only possible in fantasy in your work.
should I start, or do you want to start, Leo? Or do you have a, yeah.
Please go ahead, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I love this because this is something, I talk about a lot, is like magic. But I'll start with saying, like, I think that the way that magic is important to me in my work is really distinctively like a magical realism, where everyday objects, like actual materials and the world around you is magic. It's not, actually, to kind of go back to what Leo was talking about being a god. And I forget, I wish I'd wrote down the quote that you said that really resonated with me, but what?
I'll send it to you later.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in some ways I agree with it, and then other ways it's really antithetical the way I think about things, because in some ways that quote made me think of like high magic, where it's like you're the hero, you're the god going through this world and like conducting magic onto things, versus magical realism, where there's no sort of like hero arc, like the world around you is just like chaotically magic, and there's a kind of banality to it that is, like, to me, I think the way that could be very radical to approach the world and kind of see all these entities around us as gods. And like you were talking about, I forget the question, but the genetic cloning kind of implication of playing God or being a god. It's like, well, that maybe isn't a problem if you're playing God, if the genes are also gods. If like everything around you is also God, then there's this like kind of, there, I don't know, that, like, that's how I think of magic or something, where it's like everything is a god, and you can like, but not that that's like really true literally necessarily, but the fact that you could look at something and imagine that it is a god, or imagine that it's magic, that's the thing. Does that make sense? It's not to say that like anything is possible, but to look at something with that lens, that it is capable of being magical.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, does that make sense? Yeah.
That's a really great answer. I think for me, I think for me, like I struggle a little bit to put my finger on like what exactly like magic is. Like I guess like I of course I understand like a certain sort of subjective wonder, maybe also like a intersubjective, maybe like a specific like cultural wonder for something. I think it's I keep thinking about this quote, like another quote, Arthur C. Clarke, who's a writer, and he actually wrote the novel that went on to be made into this movie 2001. So like like somebody who like thought about technology in the 20th century. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think like, I mean, sometimes I mean, I'm sure that everybody like feels old at some like on a sort of like everyday basis, when like some like like you see new technology arriving, and you kind of like, oh wow, what the fuck is that, and like so I think it's like a like that sort of encounter with magic is like a is to an extent maybe like a very common thing nowadays, but that's like also maybe to an extent where I feel like I personally feel desensitized to like to seeing something magical. For example, I'm absolutely sure that I could walk into an Apple store and something will be floating and it's like the new thing or something, and like my mind would just go, oh, of course, like they figured that
It's
out.
not slippery, it's technology. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
No, but
like, so
that's exactly why it's radical, because to think magically, because like I think, well, maybe the better word is like enchantment, like enchantment. And I think capitalism like actively disenchants things, because the only way that objects can exist in capitalism, or the only like understanding of them in capitalism, is that they are they're ingredients for manufacturing value, and they're not entities like with mystical properties in any way. It's like, if like, I love that example you just said of like walking into the Apple store, because it's like, yeah, like within capitalism, like none of those objects are magical. They're literally just like objects that have like have been assigned a certain extractive value, or a certain level of expenditure. So like, I think thinking of it where, okay, maybe if we think of things outside of that limit of, you know, how an object functions, maybe that's
It's like the only way to allow it to be magical, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's this really great quote by this philosopher Daniel Dennett about magic, where he says something about how, like, when people are talking about real magic, they mean miracles and like supernatural powers, but conjuring tricks, technologies and things of that nature are not real magic. So real magic, in other words, refers to the magic that is not real, while the magic that can actually be done and materialized in the world is like never real magic. There's like something ironic about that wordplay that I think we're kind of getting to here. I think we're at just about at time. But this has been really great. I feel like we always get to like the juiciest parts of the discussion right at the very end, when
It's
like
a great
people
way to
stop.
end it. Yeah.
But yeah, it was really beautiful. I love that we're ending on this note about magic, and to me also left a little note for you guys in the chat that doesn't need to be responded to necessarily, but it's about the way you both engage with patents and how they enact themselves in these behavioral large systems, and how the patent is kind of this blueprint for dreaming and maybe a blueprint for magic as well, in the way that we've described here.
I love that. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. And thank you, Sarah, for inviting us all to be in dialogue. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I think this is being recorded, so Sarah will probably distribute it in one way or another. Hi, Genevieve. Good to see everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.